let's kick off. Um, I am so happy to have you today and so grateful for your time. We have just launched this discussions with experts, and it is a real treat to have you as an expert, also an author of a book. Share your knowledge, share your expertise to help more parents. And I have read your book. I love your book. I encourage more parents to read your book. And I'm just excited to talk to you about it. So before we jump into the discussion about your book, tell us a little bit, give us your name again, tell us the title of your book, although I see it in your backdrop there in your window, and tell us more about you so we can understand your incredible experience and expertise.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I am Maya Smart, the author of Reading for Our Lives, a literacy action plan from birth to six. And it's a book that was really just inspired by my journey as a mom who became really curious about reading, how it develops, and what parents can do to support that process. My daughter is now 12, so I have a skilled, fluent reader who's a middle schooler, spending a lot of time in her school library making her own choices about what she wants to read. So I have
And it's
had
so exciting to hear, and as a mom, it's like, yay, my child chooses to read. All right, tell us more. Sorry to interrupt you. I was just saying
yes,
that's the
no.
magic moment when your child starts to say, I'm picking out a book that I love.
Absolutely. But I remember when she was a toddler reading articles and newspapers about just these horrible disparities in reading achievement between Black students and white students and lower socioeconomic students and higher socioeconomic students. And I knew, being a book lover and strong reader myself who'd attained high levels of education, that there wasn't anything inherently about being Black that was preventing kids from learning. There were other factors. Had to be differences in access to books, access to high quality instruction, access to, I had a lot of question marks about what the specific things were that needed to be done within homes, but I had a really high level of confidence that if someone told parents what they should be doing, most parents would do their best to try to support their kid from the earliest days. So I really just got curious about, well, what are parents supposed to do to support this process?
I'm so excited to talk to you because I would say at least 3 to 6 times a week, we get a random email to our email account at Clever Noodle, or I get some, text from a friend of a friend, or some kind of other outreach where it's a parent saying, I want to help. What do I do? And I think there's so little information out there about what a parent can do. So I'm excited to talk to you about that. I want to jump back to such a critical thing you said in your opening, which is there is nothing inherently different about any of our children learning to read effectively. And you articulated it so beautifully. It's about access, it's about expectations, it's about books, it's about classroom quality. And I just interestingly recently have really been experiencing where in districts that are still using curriculum that is not aligned to the science of reading, that what is happening is low income children are receiving this same poor instructional material and the same poor teaching as their white, middle, and upper middle class counterparts. And so collectively, they're all not getting what they need. And yet, again and again, I hear from parents, well, I have to take matters into my own hands. So now I'm paying $95 an hour twice a week for my child to get tutoring and the support to become a proficient reader. And so, it's like, well, of course, then, when you look at the data, those families that can write the check or send the Venmo to pay for the tutor, their kids are going to progress because they're doing it outside of the system. And then the children who don't have those financial resources are not going to progress because they're in that same school system that isn't doing what they need to do. And so I've really been thinking a lot about that and how what we're seeing in the data isn't actually telling us the picture, right? Because even in schools where there's not good teaching or not good material and not the combination of both, the middle class and the upper middle class families can just go deal on their own outside of our schools, whether it be an independent school or a public school. Many of them across both, sides are not preparing our children. And I thought, that's what the data is telling us. The data is actually telling us that there's an economic difference that is playing out to show up as we would understand that some kids are getting support and some kids are not. So I would love to hear a little bit more. You just said it so beautifully in terms of the difference and why we're seeing that difference, and just any other thoughts you have on that. I think it's such an important conversation for us right now.
It is really important, and you hit the nail on the head that the difference is access and instruction. So if kids across districts are getting poor instruction and some kids are getting better results, why is that? And so you pointed to the tutoring. In my book, I mentioned some of the incredible statistics on the growth of the private tutoring industry and the growth in tutoring moving to younger and younger ages. So there are the kids who are getting tutored once their parents recognize there's an issue, or their parents are paying for some sort of assessment outside, again, outside of the school, because many schools aren't assessing kids early enough when there are challenges identified. And they're like, oh, well, wait, it just takes some kids a little longer. But then there are also parents who are being very proactive and anticipating that school isn't going to meet their kids' needs. So they're signing up for Kumon reading in preschool or whatever private tutoring option is available in their communities. But the bottom line is we have to have more people who are capable of teaching reading in the way that we know science suggests that we should. And the people who do that can be parents, can be grandparents, can be tutors, definitely should be teachers. But as you know, there's a learning curve for professional development, for teacher training. When people have decades and decades of doing things in an effective way, it's really a slow turning ship to get a lot of universities to teach their students, to teach our kids how to read.
I think it's such a tragedy because teacher after teacher that I speak with, and just from my own experience in schools, I know people don't go into teaching in such a difficult profession not deeply caring about kids, right? People go into teaching, such a hard profession, such an underpaid profession, because they love children and they want to do right by children. And then the travesty is that we don't prepare them appropriately. We don't teach them effectively to be able to teach in a way that is aligned to the science and the evidence we now know. And then it's difficult for them. I talked to a teacher who said, I was so close to resigning because I just felt like a failure year over year. And I felt like I just couldn't move my kids. And then she went through a year-long training program on the science of reading and how to implement it in the classroom, even before her district got the curriculum that matched. And 95% of her children finished first grade reading on grade level. And, so she said, I'm in, I'm not quitting, I'm staying. And just the magical moment she got to have because she knew what to do.
One of our writers, Krista, who does most of the book roundups, is a pre-K teacher. So she used it with, I believe, a bunch of 5-year-olds.
Oh, that's fantastic. And how did it go?
She really enjoyed it. She said the kids enjoyed playing it. I think there was I haven't spoken with her about it, but I know there was some confusion around some of the words being able to sound them out and then some you can't, which is kind of the
Right.
point.
Yeah. Well,
So they kind of
please,
wanted it to
please.
be one way or the other.
Well, please. I mean, part of what we're trying to do there is, debunk the myth. The number of teachers that have told me all sight words are irregular is dozens, right? Dozens upon dozens. And they say, that's why you have to have the kids memorize them. And I'm like, No, 95% of them are regular, 5% is irregular. And so actually for the 95%, you can teach kids to decode. And then for the 5% irregular, then you may have to work with them on like recognition and automaticity and more of what we consider memorization of a whole word, but they don't need to memorize the rest. And then as they get older and they learn the different, O, which should be so straightforward, has so many different sounds, O-A, O-U, O-W. And once they start to understand that, which takes a while, that's not what they get in phonics early on. It's lessons later, then they'll begin to understand, oh, I recognize that sound pattern too. That's that OU. But right now, it's not what they're learning. Oh, not not oh. So anyway, but it's been a really interesting thing showing teachers the difference in how many are regular and how few are irregular, because most of them think they're all irregular, which then of course affects how they think you can teach kids. So Maya, I think we're seeing, the teachers that are getting prepared with the proper training and then being supported with high quality curriculum that matches the evidence we know, really having increasing and dramatically improving results for children. And it's so exciting. Let's flip to the parents. Parents, it's hard to ask parents to become reading specialists because it's not really their job. But I would love to hear from you more about the big things parents can do if they decide they really want to learn about this science and what that enables them to do at home. And then let's go to the other side of the understandable continuum where parents have busy lives and they can't become the reading expert. What else can they do? So let's start with the I'm all in as a parent. I'm going to somehow figure this out. It's a really big lift for parents. But tell us more about those stories, and then we'll go to let's talk about parents that are going to do the parental role and not dig in as the teacher as well.
Absolutely. So, just as teachers are seeking out more and more opportunities to learn about the science of reading so that they can help the students in their classroom gain skills, parents are doing the same thing. Parents are seeing the work that teachers are doing, and they're doing those mental calculations and realizing by the time this teacher is trained and feeling confident in teaching some of these skills, my child will be in third grade or fourth grade or fifth grade. So there is a little, frankly, anxiety on the part of parents who have listened to the podcast or read the articles and learned about the challenges in teaching. And so some parents are just taking reading into their own hands and saying, I'm going to teach my child to read before they even get to kindergarten. And so those parents are picking up books like Teach Your Child to Read and 100 Easy Lessons and a number of other resources, or they're educating themselves. They're signing up and taking the online courses, as I did. When my daughter was a toddler, I took a University of Virginia course in the foundations of reading instruction. Now, I found from that experience that that coursework was most relevant for teaching large numbers of kids in a classroom setting who were older than my daughter was at that time. So I had to do some additional digging to figure out, well, what do you do when they're 4 or 3 or 2 or 1 or a newborn? What do you do prenatally even? And so part of the mission of my book was to give parents who do want to learn more an easy on ramp into the literature that focuses, it has, tons and tons of footnotes so people can check my work and see where I'm getting the recommendations from. But it also has a lot of practical everyday routines and practices that you can do to have an impact for your child. So for parents who don't want to take or don't have the time or the
Yeah,
money
don't have the
or the
time.
resources to enroll in a course and dig into the details in the way that I did or the way that you did to create a game to address these issues. Um, Through my book and other resources, they can learn how to build their child's language skills easily in everyday life. So I have 2 different chapters that are on how we talk to our kids and the importance of back and forth exchanges and asking questions and intentionally building vocabulary. So those things can be done even by a parent who doesn't have great literacy skills, because it really is about that relationship, about paying attention to your child and listening to them and responding even before they're speaking in words and sentences. And we forget that kids need a strong experiences with a lot of different words in order to make sense of what they see in print. It's not just about decoding, it's not just about phonics, it's about background knowledge and words and language. So there are a number of things that parents can do to move the needle for kids, but I always tell people to start with just talking.
Yeah. You just said so many amazing things. I'm going to go back and go through them a little bit slower. So, one of the things that you said that I really want to underscore is the dialogue, is the communication back and forth. And I am remiss that I didn't know that. And so I thought if I just read to my child, if I just keep reading and keep reading and keep reading, he's going to hear all this and it's going to be really effective. And then later I read, oh no, I'm supposed to actually be talking to him about this book. And even when he can't yet respond, I'm still supposed to be talking to him. And I thought, well, what does that look like? What am I supposed to say, particularly if he can't respond? And I began to see that it's even as simple as like, oh, Kanique has on a green dress, and Susan has on a red dress. So the child is beginning to learn the colors. You know, Kanique is playing in the snow. I wonder what that feels like. It's cold. Wow, what does it feel like when we're cold? Even if the child isn't responding. What other tips do you have for parents that is about this dialogue piece? And parents often say to me, but my kid can't answer. And I say, still ask the questions. Talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's something so simple that we can all do. And I didn't know to do it.
Right. So the turn taking, the back and forth, the dialogue that you mentioned, this idea of the parent saying something and then the child saying something, even if we can't make sense of it, is so important because that's where they're processing and learning and expanding and attempting to build those and actually building those expressive and receptive vocabulary skills. So it the asking questions is powerful because it automatically makes you pause and wait for a response. So even when you're talking to a pre-verbal infant and you're saying, "Oh, look at the such and such," and you're pointing, I always advocate pointing and labeling. Like your finger is such a powerful tool, whether or not you have a book in hand. So some people naturally will trace text when they're reading a picture book with a baby, and that's helpful. They'll learn that the text is running from left to right, that the text goes from the top of the page to the bottom of the page, and all of those things. But even in regular life, pointing to objects and labeling them is so important. We forget that kids have to learn all of these words. They have to learn the colors and the objects and the pillow in my background or the lamp or the book, or we give them that language nourishment. I call it in the book language nutrition. So when we think of
Such
it
a nice phrase.
that way, we're more likely to remember that we're giving them something, we're giving them this meal, but they also need to digest it. So it's a participation, a
That's
joint
a wonderful phrase. I love the nutrition, because you think as a little baby, when you're the mom of a little baby, oh, I got to give my kids some carrots. I got to give my kids some broccoli. I got to develop their palate for the vegetables and the fruits, not just the other proteins and the carbs. And I think that analogy is so powerful of a chair is not a chair until you name it a chair, right? A chair is not a chair until it gets that label and repetition that your child knows, oh, that in that background there, with that beautiful print and that pillow is a chair. So that's a great way, I think, to think about it, as you're building nutrition there as well. I love that phrase. You also talked about vocabulary. And I think I often get the question of, can I just get a list and say the words to my child and give them the definition? And I say, no, that's not how we teach vocabulary. Talk about vocabulary acquisition.
I think when we're talking about vocabulary, we have to think about content, but also context.
Mm.
So we want to give kids, and it's the way many of us were taught, these like just lists of things in black and white. But again, it's not very dynamic. It's not very fun. It's not integrated into everyday life. And things are just more meaningful when it's a part of what you're touching, tasting, smelling, feeling in the course of everyday life. So I like for parents to build vocabulary when cooking. I think that's a great you're preparing, even if you're like me and can't really cook, you're more assembling things or warming things. That's still vocabulary. Oh, we need to heat this up. Or, oh, let's chop this into 1, 2, 3 pieces. So that even that mathematical vocabulary that you get from counting, and
Yeah.
again, labeling the things, that there's so much richness just in these simple things we're doing every day. And I think that that's really a teaching advantage for parents that classroom teachers don't have. You're one on one, maybe one on two or three, depending on how many kids you have with you in that moment. But you have that relationship, you have that bond, and you have these natural activities, these meal times, bath time, bedtime, transit time, and the grocery store time. And there's an infinite number of things that you can label and describe and ask their opinion on things. Oh, do you like this? Or, you mash up the banana. Ooh, it's squishy. Describe the texture. Oh, it tastes kind of sweet. Do you like that? And then listen to the coos babbled, eventually words, sentences, paragraphs that you get back. But it's so much more meaningful than a list of words on a piece of paper.
I also read in your book some other concepts I really loved and helped me. One was just narrate, which is what you're talking about right now. Just narrate and say, you know, I'm squishing the banana. I'm changing your diaper. Oh, it's smelly. But just narrate what you're doing, and that's building the vocabulary of the children in the world. You also, in their world, I should say, you also talked about um, background knowledge. And that's kind of a nice new buzzword that's playing out. And a lot of people are hearing background knowledge. What does that mean?
I think it is just again, if we think about content and context, it's what things mean. Like we're reading not just to sound out words on a page, but we're reading for meaning and understanding and connection. So I think about my daughter is very into sports. And so we'll have conversations about articles that we've read about different games or sports figures and their biographies. And so the background knowledge is history of the game, personal history of that person. Maybe it has something to do with the nature of the field, if it's grass or if it's turf. So to me, the background knowledge is just kind of like the richness of things. And there's in everything that kids are doing, there's math, there's science, there's weather. Why does the rain have this effect on the ground? Or why does the sun, why does it feel like it's harder to run and do some of the things that you need to do on the field? So you're branching into science, you're branching into other things through, again, just everyday life. I feel like it's the things that we're doing. We have to give parents in particular ways to enrich what's already happening and bring more words
That's
to it. And
so helpful. And I think there's so many opportunities for us that I missed because I hadn't yet read your book and I hadn't read the research and I hadn't really understand. I was, an exhausted mom working and trying to, breastfeed and be a mom. And, I just thought if I just read. But even things when you talk about all the richness of our lives that we can bring meaning to and we can bring literacy to, and even math and science, as you say, but it was like, oh, I can even drive down the road and point out signs and say, that's a sign and it says this word. And even before the child could read it, it started to help them understand this hieroglyphic, was what I call it, of these symbols that are letters, which then make up words and sounds, that I could start to help the child understand there is this print, there is this set of symbols that represent words, and it was just the beginning of kind of getting that. But you have all these great tips in your book, and I'm thrilled that you're articulating some of them so beautifully for us because I think there's just so much we can do. Um,
with
that
that explanation piece that you're describing, I also advise people to introduce, and if you've gone virtual yourself and keep all your notes and things on your phone, for a child, they don't know what you're doing, or particularly a young child on your phone. They don't know that you're writing the grocery list as opposed to scrolling on Instagram, or they just don't know. It's this kind of black box. So I do like people to go old school a little bit with the grocery list and explain, oh, we're out of apples. and I'm going to write apple. And you write and you show them, you with your pen and your paper. And then later, when you're in the grocery store, you pull the paper out again and you say, this is the list that we were working on at home. And this says apple, and I'm going to reach and get an apple. So, again, that kind of narration and explaining, to me, it sounds very simple, but they aren't going to understand that you've written this thing that you can have at a future time in a different place and it means something. So I
Yeah.
think the more we
Yeah.
talk about those things, I think those are really powerful everyday lessons that we underestimate.
When you talked about the math, which was another aha moment just in this discussion with you for me of like, oh, you can also bring math into it. And now you're talking about this grocery list and what we're out of, which I think is so interesting. I just had this thought in my head like, oh, you pull out the drawer with fruit and you say, how many apples do we have? And you count them with your child. And then you say, we have 8, we're good on apples. How many oranges? We only have one. I think we need more,
And
and
then you
then you're in
ask
the
them,
store.
do you think we need more oranges? Do we
Oh,
have
even
more
better.
apples or more oranges? Do we need more? And then give them that
Oh,
chance to
that's even better. That's even far
respond.
better. And that is just so great because it takes it to another level of their cognitive thinking, their critical thinking, their being responsible for solving a problem, which we talk about, but how you make that concrete and real, I didn't even think of that. And then you just added another level of depth that is getting them doing the thinking, opposed to me saying, we need more oranges, saying to them, I love the, do we have more apples or oranges? Do you think we need more oranges? And putting the work for them to really think about this question to them. That's a great example. You also mentioned prenatal. I think most of us, similar to what we were talking about before with literacy nutrition, we think I need to eat really well, right? I need to eat for this baby such great food so that I'm building their nutrition. But you mentioned literacy nutrition prenatally. Talk about what that looks like.
Well, there's some research that's cited in the book about at what point the fetus, I guess is an accurate term, can hear and recognize the
Mm,
mother's voice. So that's just interesting that when we think about, at what point what we're doing matters. So from the moment of inception, everything matters. Like what you're eating, I was talking recently to a group that specializes in interventions for kids who are birth to 3 who have developmental delays. And one of the things they mentioned was the importance of prenatal care for the mom and
mm.
going to those visits and getting the information and seeking to be your best, healthiest self. And then just from a reading perspective, I would add start reading to the baby before they're born as well, just to help get yourself in the habit before you're stressed out with the diapers and the figuring out how to feed them and keep them alive and all that.
You talk about them. That's other really helpful information for all of us. And again, something I didn't know. I talked a little bit to the baby, to the fetus, but I also didn't understand how many neural pathways for literacy were forming in utero, and then how critical that 0 to 3 is, and then 0 to 5 in the brain development. And so we have to do a lot of work early because learning to read is dependent on a complex network of neural pathways. And I didn't know that. So maybe a couple thoughts about that research, which I know and you wrote beautifully about in your book. What are some just things parents should know about that?
Again, just going back to what we mentioned earlier about these back and forth exchanges, that really is the mechanism of so much learning and growing for our little ones. So give them the words, give them the chance to respond. One study found, it was a longitudinal study that tracked the word count of adults and also children. So this study, in particular, one was 18 to 24 months. And it found the kids that were in that highest level of back and forth exchanges with their caregivers years later, when they were middle schoolers, had better vocabulary, had better expressive and receptive vocabulary skills, had higher IQs even. So like very young, we're doing things that have long-term implications. And so most of us didn't have the luxury of having these devices to measure how much we're talking, so we don't know how well we did at that stage, but it applies later as well. Like brains, it's not saying if you didn't do this by 3, your child is out of luck. Like brains are still very malleable, and connections can be forged over time. So we should continue to have those conversations.
Well, that's so true. I have a son who has dyslexia, and I had to do a lot of research to learn about dyslexia, and that's where I started to do the research and understand how how much plasticity the brain has. And I think that's relatively new. I don't think we knew how malleable the brain is and how the brain can keep learning for your whole life. And in fact, should, if you want to be an older person with a strong cognitive, functionality, you got to keep learning and keeping that brain fresh. Um, and I think particularly with dyslexic children, there's this sense that it's this static thing, they have dyslexia. Yes, they do, and that will always have some impact on their development and their reading, and they may always read a little slower than a child that doesn't have dyslexia. And the earlier we intervene and the more we can do, the more we help accelerate their development of the neural pathways to get them onto the right track. And I wonder, you have such a strong research knowledge. Are there any things that you could share? It is Dyslexia Month. Are there any things you could share for the parents of children who have dyslexia, of things they might be able to do to help their children out?
So for me, that sounded like most parents don't know that their child has dyslexia until the child is well into the school year. So for parents of younger children, I would say to get very in tune with your own observations and feelings about your child's development. So with younger children, if you are reading and they aren't showing as much interest in the book, if they're pushing it away, if they're all the different things, not necessarily saying that's a sign of dyslexia, but I like for parents to get in the habit of documenting what they're seeing, observing with their child. I even say write, and these notes you can keep in your phone if you want. You can use a notes app or in a physical journal, whichever you prefer. But I like the idea of writing down what you're observing and feeling about your child's reading journey with the date, and particularly noting any concerns or worries that you have about, maybe it's a speech development issue, or you're doing nursery rhymes or certain games related to the sounds within words, and you feel like maybe something isn't feels amiss. And we also often, as parents, we're not specialists. We don't know exactly what the warning signs are, but we do all, I think, have, when we listen to them, these intuitions and inklings. And so honor that by writing it down and dating it. And then when you have the well child visits with your pediatrician, which occur at, different intervals, and eventually it gets to just annual. But when they're younger, sometimes it's every week when they're first born, and then monthly and every few months. Bring your questions and concerns. And also, because you've written things down, you'll see the persistence of some challenges or concerns you had, but others will fall away. And that will give you some confidence as well. Like, oh, I was so worried about them doing this particular thing, and they aren't doing that anymore. It's fine. So that's one thing I encourage parents. And the other thing is to have kind of a refer to developmental guidelines, like from a reputable source. So the CDC has developmental milestones, and not that you're judging your child or trying to like teach to those standards, but just so you have some context, some idea in your mind of what kids are typically able to do or know at certain ages and stages.
Those are incredible tips. I love those. Where were you when I first had a child? The other thing I learned retroactively and wish I had understood earlier, your observation point, I like that you're making that so explicit. I would observe some of the physical things with my child, and I noticed very young when he was trying to pull up, those little the little jamboree things where they can pull the little toys. And I started noticing he's always using his right arm. And I thought, well, that's probably just his dominant arm. That makes sense. But the more I watched, the more I realized, and again, to your point of observation, but the physical observation, to me at that time was much easier and more obvious. And So he would continue to pull with his right hand and he would never use his left arm. And so I started putting toys into his left hand and he would drop them. And so then I went to the well visit and I said, Is this normal? And I didn't know if it was normal or abnormal. And I thought, it might just be dominant. He might be right hand dominant. And so then the doctor was able to try it. And she said, No, it's not. He's not using his left hand. I know that you had a birth issue, a delivery issue where his arm was trapped. And I think he has brachial plexus, and I might have just said that incorrectly. And I think we need to get him into physical therapy immediately and occupational therapy. And so we did. And in 6 months, he was perfectly able to use both arms and has never had an issue since. So the other thing I learned is that there are actual early indicators of dyslexia. They're not always causal. It's not always your child will have dyslexia, but to your point of observing, there are things we see that may be correlative and are early indicators, and then help us understand that we can and should screen our child in kindergarten so that if we're seeing the early signs of dyslexia, we can intervene earlier and give them more support. But some of those signs, and you may know additional ones, you mentioned the rhyming. And so rhyming was a big one. I would try to rhyme with my child. I would read the Dr. Seuss books, and he never rhymed. And I just assumed he didn't like rhyming, right? Like for whatever reason. And then I learned later, oh, that's an early indicator. He couldn't rhyme. He also couldn't remember his alphabet, the sounds or the names of the letters, particularly sequentially. And so, oh, that's another big sign that there may be something happening. And the other one I learned, which I was fascinated about, was colors, remembering the colors. And he would never remember the colors. And I'd always think, like, the kid seems smart, but he can never remember that yellow is yellow. And so I would paint the colors on the bathtub wall. I would give him the squirty paints, and I'd be like, what color is that? And he'd say orange. And I was like, it's blue. We've talked about this 20 times. Why? But now I understand that that's an early indicator. Again, not 100%, but a leading indicator. And I didn't know any of those. And I wish now I would have, because I would have intervened earlier than second grade had I known. Any other quick indicators that you could share that people could watch for?
I think the ones that you've mentioned, particularly the rhyming piece, is one that I often hear from experts. Just if people don't understand that the ability to discern the different sounds within a word is just a critical, important part of becoming a reader. And this whole process we do of teaching kids to sound things out. If a child isn't able to hear that cat has those three sounds, the k, at, and then blend, we just skip over that piece. And so that is a skill that's developed. So in the book, we'll talk about phonological. Some people say phonological, some say phonological awareness, but that awareness of sounds within words. And so there are bigger pieces of that, like syllables and rhymes. And then you get more specific. So can they discern beginning sounds or ending sounds? Can they, as I just did with cat, hear all the sounds in between? And it's sort of a process that emerges over time, but you need to do like the songs and the games and the nursery rhymes in order to have some sense of where your child is with that. And again, none of this, the big thing I would leave parents with is not to actively worry or be anxious or stressed out. Parenting in general is stressful. Particularly, I feel like coming out of COVID, there's just a lot on everyone's plates. So none of this is to make you worried or anxious and feel like you have to be a researcher and document everything that your child is doing every day. But again, just sing the songs, play the games, read the books, let them explore the book, chew the book, throw the book, depending on their age. Because to your point earlier, there are fine and motor skills that relate to the ability to handle a book and write down the road and some of these other things. But be in a place of sort of relationship with your child and then honor what you're feeling when you do have concerns or notice things like they're only playing with the one hand. Jot it down and then take it to someone else. Don't feel like you have to carry it all on your own and be like the reading detective from day one. It's more about doing the things you know to do as well as you can during the course of everyday life, and then being okay with asking for help when you have concerns.
Such great advice. You have spoken a few times about relationships, and I've seen a bit of research on that as well. Talk to parents about what you mean by these relationships and how it supports literacy.
I think parenting it's just the ultimate relationship. You bring this child into the world, they're completely dependent upon you. You're holding them in your arms, you're nursing them or feeding them, you're singing, rocking, all the things. Like you are literally their caregiver. And so it should be at its best is like this loving, wonderful, beautiful relationship, but there is also a lot of work involved. There's diaper changing and laundry and grocery shopping and paying the bills and
And feeding, as you mentioned.
all those things. And so you have to always remind yourself to stay in that place of relationship and understand that the learning is happening not through lecturing or how we might have learned in school, but the learning is happening through really simple things. It's happening through eye contact and conversation and pointing to things and labeling things and asking questions and waiting for responses. And I have a middle schooler, it's the same now, like my attempt to to parent and keep her attention more than her friends and devices and all these things. It really boils down to the conversations that we have and the attention that we give and this back and forth exchange. So all the things we've talked about doing with babies and toddlers and preschoolers, I think still applies. I'm still teaching her vocabulary using these same techniques, and
Same
I think it'll
strategy.
help with some
You're
tests down the road or something.
The other thing I read about relationships and thought another sort of, oh, aha, is that when you're reading a book with your child, particularly when they're little and they're sitting on your lap, the child starts to associate happy moments, connecting with a parent, connecting with a grandparent, connecting with a caregiver around reading. And that sort of, I guess, implicit feeling plays out over time of reading feels good. Reading is about relationship. Literacy conversation feels good. It feels like I'm being seen. It feels like I'm being heard. And that all that very sort of, I guess, subconsciously, but kind of gets into the body and feeling around reading is this joyful thing. Reading and talking and connecting is this great thing for me. And so I thought that was really interesting as well.
It is. It's so true the way books can bring families together. You have all those shared memories and conversations that you've had. And some families will have favorite books that they return to over and over again. And
Yes.
I was conducting interviews recently with parents who have children between the ages of 2 and 5, just
Oh,
asking them about their reading concerns for their kids. And in so many of those interviews, they mentioned stories that they had read, favorite picture books and stories that they had read with their parents or grandparents, and this strong desire to want to give their kids that same experience. So it sticks with you, it lasts.
a tradition too. As you're talking about all of these incredible things and giving us such guidance for what parents can do, that's very rich and very meaningful. And, again, I want to underscore not every parent needs to become an expert in reading, but there's all these other things that are so important and are in some ways sort of easy. I mean, despite parent life being hectic, but I think it's so great to have all these tools. And I love your point of the parent actually has more hours to help than a teacher can. And so there's just so much that we can do. Even little things like modeling reading instead of being on your phone. I love your grocery store list. You're writing it out, you're showing your child the writing of it, opposed to doing it on your phone. And again, it's modeling, it's showing them that you write and you read rather than do technology. And they may not, they're not going to know you're doing the grocery list. They're just going to think mom's on her phone again. Um, so this is incredible. Any parting comment you have or thought for parents?
I would just say to parents that you are your child's first and best teachers, undoubtedly. And you have everything that you need to do a wonderful job just by virtue of the love that you have for your child and your voice to read to them and talk to them, and also to advocate for them when you need schools or pediatricians or specialists to get involved and help them get to their next level as readers. So you've got this, you can do it, and you're not
You
alone.
you are your child's first and best teacher. I love it. And I love the addition of advocacy because so many of us have to advocate for our child to get what they deserve and need. And I would just say every parent out there that has the social capital, the means, the knowledge to advocate for their child, advocate for all the children, advocate for the whole system to improve for not just your child, but all children. Because the more we take the collective responsibility, the more we're going to move the needle. And, you and I, Maya, have been able to help advocate for our children, and that is a blessing and a privilege. There are a lot of parents that, because of, really difficult jobs, even feeling uncomfortable in the school setting themselves because they didn't have a good experience, not feeling knowledgeable enough and sophisticated enough to advocate. They may have even their own literacy issues. And so, if we can fight for our kids and advocate for our kids, but also see our kids as a broader community, and that it serves us all well when all children can read. It serves our economy well when all children can read. So I appreciate you in these final comments talking about advocacy and the advocacy for all kids, which actually brings us all the way back to the beginning of our conversation about equity and all kids needing this support. And I just want to say an enormous thank you for spending your time talking with us. I will make a plug for your book. I loved it. It's a very accessible, I don't want to say easy read because I don't mean to, bring it down from what it is. It's an incredibly well-researched, very thoughtful book. But there's some books on reading that I can't read as bedtime reading because they're just too inaccessible and textbooky. Your book was a wonderful before bed read and enjoy and do my reading time with it. Reading for Our Lives is great. It is extremely well researched. And so I also thank you for that enormous commitment to digging through and reading all that research and then bringing it to us in very accessible ways. And I learned a lot from your book. You also have a fantastic newsletter, which I read. I click on all your links. You have a great blog. And so, it's another resource that makes this easier for parents to get their head around very concrete, very tactical things we can do. And I've learned a lot from you. And so I just thank you very much for taking your time and sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom with lots of parents out there. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks.